In this episode, we're going to focus on why classification is one of the most important bridges between privacy theory and daily operational reality. Because classification is how an organization decides what kinds of personal information it has and what rules should apply to each kind. Personal information classification means grouping data into categories based on sensitivity, identifiability, context, and potential harm, so the organization can apply consistent controls rather than guessing each time. Risk and control stay consistent only when teams share the same understanding of what the data is and why it matters, because inconsistent labeling leads to inconsistent handling, which is a privacy problem even when no one intends harm. For brand new learners, the key idea is that classification is not an academic exercise or a document labeling game. It is the system that makes access decisions, sharing decisions, retention decisions, and incident response priorities defensible. Advising on classification means helping stakeholders choose categories that are clear, usable, and aligned with real privacy risks, then ensuring those categories actually drive meaningful differences in behavior. This lesson is about building that consistency so the organization treats similar personal information in similar ways across teams and systems. A good starting point is understanding what personal information means in practice, because classification depends on recognizing what can identify a person. Direct identifiers are easy to spot, like name, email address, phone number, and government identifiers. Indirect identifiers can be just as identifying, such as account IDs, device IDs, and precise location, especially when combined with other data. Behavioral data, like browsing patterns or purchase history, can become identifying when linked to an account or when patterns are unique enough. Sensitive information is not only about obvious categories like health. It includes any data that could cause significant harm if exposed or misused, and that harm depends on context. For example, an employee complaint record may be more sensitive than a customer mailing address because it affects livelihood and workplace safety. A strong classification approach recognizes that identifiability and sensitivity are not fixed labels. They emerge from how data is used, linked, and retained. When you advise on classification, you help the organization define these concepts clearly so different teams do not invent their own private definitions. Classification supports consistent risk management by turning vague concerns into actionable handling rules. Without classification, teams often apply one of two extremes. They either treat everything as highly sensitive and create rules nobody follows, or they treat most data as low risk and leave sensitive information too exposed. A usable classification scheme allows teams to apply stronger controls to high-risk data without creating unnecessary friction for low-risk data. For privacy, the goal is not to label data for labeling's sake. It is to connect categories to outcomes like who can access data, how it can be shared, whether additional transparency or choice is required, how long it can be retained, and what security safeguards are expected. Classification also helps incident response by guiding tree-off, because an incident involving highly sensitive data requires a faster and more careful response than an incident involving low-impact data. For beginners, it helps to think of classification as a set of lanes on a road. It directs traffic so decisions are smoother and less dependent on individual judgment. Consistency is a privacy outcome because it reduces surprise and reduces arbitrary treatment of data subjects. When advising on classification, one of the first decisions is how many categories to use, because complexity can destroy usability. If there are too many categories, people guess or avoid classification, and the scheme becomes unreliable. If there are too few categories, everything gets treated the same, and the classification loses its power to drive controls. A practical approach aims for categories that a non-expert can apply consistently with minimal training, while still capturing meaningful differences in privacy risk. Categories might distinguish between general personal information, sensitive personal information, and highly restricted identifiers, but the exact labels matter less than the clarity of definitions and the consistency of application. Another important consideration is whether classification should be applied at the dataset level, the field level, or both, because some datasets contain mixed sensitivity. Advising means helping stakeholders choose a level that is feasible given system capabilities and operational behavior. The scheme must match the organization's reality, or it will become a paper standard that no one follows. Another critical aspect of classification advice is connecting categories to purpose and context, because privacy risk is heavily influenced by why the data exists and how it is used. Data collected to deliver a service may have one risk profile, while the same data used for profiling or targeted marketing may have a different risk profile. Data collected in a workplace context can be more sensitive because employees often have limited ability to opt out and because consequences can be severe. Data collected from children or vulnerable populations often deserves stronger default protections because the risk of harm is higher and expectations are different. Advising on classification means making sure the scheme does not treat data as a static object. It should reflect how the data interacts with human lives. This is also where fairness enters classification, because some data can create harm through discrimination or exclusion even when it is not obviously sensitive. A scheme that captures these context-driven risks helps the organization apply appropriate controls and avoid practices that feel unfair or predatory. Classification must also account for derived and inferred data, because privacy impact often comes from what is created, not only what is collected. Derived data includes things like risk scores, customer segments, likelihood predictions, and other outputs produced by analysis. These outputs can influence decisions about people, which makes them privacy relevant even when they are not direct identifiers. Inferred data can be especially sensitive because it can reveal traits a person never explicitly shared, such as health status inferred from behavior or location patterns inferred from activity. Advising on classification means ensuring the scheme includes guidance for derived and inferred data, not just raw fields like name and address. It also means warning stakeholders that labeling raw data as low sensitivity does not guarantee derived outputs are low sensitivity. Consistent controls require recognizing when analysis increases sensitivity and therefore requires stronger safeguards and stronger transparency. Beginners should understand that privacy risk can be created by processing, not just by collection. Once categories are defined, the next advisory focus is making sure classification drives concrete control differences, because classification without consequences becomes decorative. Controls linked to classification can include access restrictions, such as limiting sensitive categories to a smaller set of roles. They can include sharing controls, such as requiring approvals and stronger contractual limits before sharing sensitive categories with vendors. They can include storage and segregation controls, such as keeping highly sensitive data in more tightly controlled environments. They can include retention controls, such as shorter retention periods for higher-risk data, unless a clear obligation requires longer retention. They can include logging controls, such as limiting sensitive fields and logs and restricting access to logs that may contain personal information. Advising here means helping teams define these control mappings in plain language so people know what changes when a dataset is labeled. Consistency comes from this mapping because it ensures teams do not invent different handling rules for the same classification category. A strong classification program also requires operational support, because humans make mistakes and systems may not enforce labels automatically. Advising, therefore, includes designing processes that help people classify correctly, such as guidance for common datasets, examples of ambiguous cases, and escalation paths for questions. It also includes training that is role-specific, so people who work with data daily understand how to apply categories and why it matters. Review mechanisms are important too, because classification can drift as systems evolve and as new uses appear. A dataset classified as low risk at launch might become higher risk when new identifiers are added or when the data is linked with another dataset. Durable classification includes periodic review, especially for high-impact systems and sensitive data flows. Beginners should see this as part of governance, where classification is maintained like a living rule set rather than a one-time exercise. Evaluating classification effectiveness is also part of advising, because you need to know whether the scheme is working in practice. Effectiveness can be assessed by whether teams can apply the scheme consistently, whether controls actually change based on labels, and whether incidents and audits reveal mismatches between labels and reality. Another evaluation signal is whether the organization can answer questions quickly, such as where sensitive data exists and who can access it. If classification is inconsistent, these questions become slow and uncertain, which is dangerous during incidents and writes requests. Evaluation can also include checking whether labels are applied only in documentation or whether they propagate into system behavior, such as access permissions and retention schedules. Advising means helping stakeholders see classification as part of a control system, not just as a taxonomy. When evaluation reveals gaps, such as overuse of a general category that hides sensitivity, the scheme may need refinement or better training. Consistent risk and controls depend on this feedback loop. As we close, remember that Task 15 is about making privacy handling predictable by helping the organization classify personal information in a way that reflects real risk and drives consistent controls. Classification begins with clear definitions of what is identifying and what is sensitive, including context, linkage, and potential harm. Advising requires choosing a scheme that is simple enough to use and detailed enough to matter, including guidance for derived and inferred data. The scheme must connect directly to handling rules, so labels drive differences in access, sharing, storage, logging, retention, and incident response. Operational support, training, and periodic review keep classification accurate as systems and uses evolve, and evaluation ensures the scheme is actually influencing behavior. When classification is advised and maintained well, similar data is treated similarly across the organization, reducing surprise and reducing arbitrary outcomes for data subjects. That consistency is one of the strongest privacy protections a program can build because it turns privacy principles into reliable, repeatable behavior.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.